Over the last week, my regular evening news service has reported at least 20 car crashes, a house fire each night, 3 murders, and I guess several tales of politicians doing the wrong thing or failing to do the right thing. We've come to expect that this is regular fare for news services. What constitutes news essentially is bad stuff. Now, it's never been any different. I've heard the same complaint for decades about news services. Now, once upon a time, I can also remember that a member of the public asked why there were no good news stories on TV. Well, it prompted a deluge of what was then the Good News Bible turning up in the letterbox of the station involved until they had so many they had no idea what to do with them. Really, one thing had nothing to do with the other. Now, if we look at the whole of human history and how it's been reported, essentially what is reported is the story of humankind. Humankind, in particular Homo sapiens, have always been savage, inconsiderate, selfish, whatever else you want to call them. That is the nature of us. Now, one thing is true of the media, and particularly television and the images it presents, is that we have become inured to all of it. We don't respond at all. Maybe we count up the number of car crashes on the news, but it certainly doesn't affect human behaviour, because the next day there will be just as much to report, and in some cases much worse. For all the reportage that's ever happened, I don't think one car crash has been prevented, one motorbike running off the road, one war, one famine, one piece of pestilence, one piece of anything really. To blame the media, though, really is not the question. If we don't report these things, I guess no one gets to know. Do they need to know? Well, they must do, or people wouldn't be watching the news on a regular basis or reading newspapers for that matter, because essentially all you are going to get is what you might call bad news. But I would suggest that bad and good don't come into this. They're simply reporting what human beings want to hear. Now, there have been innumerable studies trying to link media violence, particularly video games, to what happens in the wider world. Not one of them has ever proved a conclusive link. Well, you can find occasionally. This particular school killer, as has happened in America on a weekly basis, watched video games. But whether that triggered a belief that a gun was going to solve anything, that's an entirely different matter. And I would seriously doubt that showing images has made much of a difference at all. You see these things on the news. You see them in newspapers, you see them in photographs, you see acts of violence. Does that mean that everybody who sees them is going to turn into some sort of mass killer? Of course it doesn't. We have to accept that as a species we are essentially carnivores. There is a firm belief that the Neanderthals, who existed at least in part time alongside Homo sapiens, were killed off by Homo sapiens in the survival of the fittest. It's a story, it's a belief, it may well be true. The Neanderthals disappeared, no one has any idea why. When they certainly weren't killed by wild beasts, it had to be some other solution. So why am I bringing all of this up? In the last couple of weeks, it was reported that the Magnum Photo Agency was culling images. It was removing anything that looked like child exploitation. Now, what they were talking about were images from well in the past. If they think honestly that there is a link between these images and saving the planet from child exploitation, and obviously a good thing, saving the world from poverty, saving the world from violence by not showing images of poverty-stricken people, or even stopping wars by not showing pictures of soldiers in action, they're probably fooling themselves. Come next week, maybe a whole new philosophy will be in play that says you cannot censor history. These images were taken at the time by photojournalists whose job it was to record these things, and why are we now choosing to censor them? Well, there's an argument there. No one wants to see child exploitation, and images of it, as distressing as they may be, are the current world. We live in a world where slavery, child exploitation, poverty, misery, war, fear are all prominently available. Moving these images, is it going to change anything? Well, probably not. Now, if you don't know much about the Magnum Photo Agency, it's one of a number. They all act as an archive. Now, some are just photographs that you can download and make use of, as in depository. But Magnum is a bit different. Most, if not all, of the world's best photojournalists have passed through its ranks. It was created by three people, essentially: Robert Capa, Henri Cartier-Bresson and David Seymour, in the years after World War II. They needed a place to store all of the images that they had available. Now, since then, the gallery of images, this historical record, has become enormous. They're talking about 1 million photographs on archive. Now, let's just go back a bit. If you don't know much about Robert Capa, he was a photographer during the Spanish Civil War. He turned the war into something that Americans in particular could understand. They probably wouldn't have even known it existed up till that point. He was also the photographer who swam ashore with soldiers on D-Day, and the few photographs that remain of the reel that he took, most of the photographs were destroyed, you can see there are soldiers dying in the water. Now, this is the only record of that moment in history. It's one thing shooting it from the beach, it was quite another swimming amongst soldiers as bullets and bombs fell on them and trying to avoid the great chunks of metal that were parked in the sea. Others are the same. This sort of record, you could say, well, what Robert Capa did was glorify war. Soldiers are dying, but, the bigger purpose, the saviour of freedom, or whatever you might want to call it. Now, if you start taking out pictures like this, where you've got so few anyway, what have you got left? Now, over the course of time, so many of those photojournalists died, most of them quite young. The general belief was that if you wanted to get a good enough photograph, you had to be very close on the battlefront, and many of them simply died being that close. The images they left us are an invaluable record. On the other side of this equation, though, is the question of balance. When photojournalists shoot at a battlefront, or anywhere else for that matter, they are recording. Every attempt is made not to introduce bias. You shoot everything. Now, how it's edited afterwards or how the images are used often has nothing to do with the photojournalist at all. A picture that ends up on the front page of a paper, that is down to a sub-editor deciding which picture will best sell newspapers. How it gets used after that, that's something else again. But the actual raw material, that is the honest and open viewpoint of a photojournalist at work. There's also this, the basic conundrum to do with love, hate, war, peace, that you can't know one without the other. Now, that's been a factor all through human history. The church preached both. You had to be good, you'd end up in hell. So if you don't have one, you can't know the other. Well, the same thing goes with photojournalism. If you choose not to print or archive the excesses of humanity, and you only, say, present good stories, you end up with imbalance. Now, it works both ways. Now, often the work of photojournalists ends up being propaganda. Now, I can think of plenty of examples of this. Heroes. If you look at a couple of the films that came out of World War II, on whichever side it was, they told you that, well, God was on your side, you were on the right side, and the enemy was all wrong. Well, it's just propaganda. The soldiers in the trenches or on the battlefield certainly didn't think like that. They were down to just simple survival. There are other examples too, say from World War I. No pictures of soldiers on the battlefield were printed, and neither were negative stories about the number of casualties. There is no way they could have got, the 20 million men to volunteer to go and die if they thought that was the case. The propaganda said, yes, it's a noble cause, you've got every chance of surviving. Well, the truth was far from that, but it took the end of the war and way beyond to realise that. And of course, once you get to the Vietnam War and it's all over television every night, you simply couldn't hide the fact. People were dying. When you have room for only a handful of stories in a half-hour news broadcast, you have to decide what you're going to use. On any given day, there are a million stories. That sounds like a lot, but there probably are. Now, someone has to decide what they're going to use. A local news service may well say, well, I don't care that 60,000 people died in an earthquake in India, I didn't know any of them. But just down the road from the station, there was, a marijuana crop discovered. Of course, we all want to know about that, and do we actually know the people involved? Well, it's possible, I suppose. News has always been selective. That doesn't mean to say that photojournalism should be selective, nor should an archive be selective. I can't find any examples of where an image has actually prevented anything. Now, if we look at two particular images that come to mind, Kevin Carter's Baby and Vulture and Nick Ut's naked girl running away from the battlefront where a home had been destroyed by napalm and bombing by the Americans. You could say, as happened in Kevin Carter's case, he should have gone and rescued the child before the vulture got there. Well, that wasn't his job. And the poor man suffered from that much guilt. He eventually committed suicide, but the media certainly didn't help. He should have gone and done something about it. He wasn't the only one there. There were a truckload of journalists and United Nations workers. There were all sorts of people around. The fact that he took the picture didn't make him guilty. Then you get Kevin Ut and the naked girl running away. Well, is this child exploitation? The poor thing is naked. She's running away from American aggression. Is it a political statement? I don't think that Nick Ut thought of either of those things. He saw a girl running down the street. At that moment, it symbolised everything that was wrong with the war. Civilians being killed, and here was a poor girl who, and apparently she lived on. I did see a documentary of her in later life, and she actually survived all this, burns and all. But did he say to himself, I mustn't take this picture? Well, no, he didn't. If this now culling of Magnum takes out pictures like either of these two, I honestly don't know what to say. These are important historical moments by photojournalists who were as honest as they could in what they took, and later interpretations have nothing to do with it. When I read the other day that 100 people, mostly men apparently, had looked up child prostitute on the Magnum site to try and find these photos in question, that doesn't negate what the photographers actually took or what the pictures say. It says more about 100 people who've got no lives whatsoever other than looking for child prostitutes. Well, we know the porn market is huge and gets bigger every year. Maybe they should be doing the culling. But I honestly cannot see the archives of porn photographs around the world being culled by anybody, because the market is huge, and here we are pandering to the worst aspects of humanity. It has ever been the same.